The summer of 1518 in Strasbourg, a bustling city of the Holy Roman Empire, came with a searing heat that seemed to weigh upon every rooftop, every cobblestone, and every weary soul who walked its streets. The Rhine flowed sluggishly in the distance, its waters warm and sluggish under the heavy sun, while the air itself shimmered as if the city were wrapped in a furnace. Merchants lined the streets with their carts of grain, spices, and cloth. Peasants dragged themselves in from the surrounding countryside to sell produce, and nobles retreated to shaded halls of stone. Yet in this otherwise ordinary city, where heat, hunger, and hardship were nothing new, something was about to erupt that would etch Strasbourg forever into the strangest pages of history. It began not with a battle, not with a miracle, not with a storm, but with a woman who danced. Her name was Frau Trophia. Accounts say she stepped into the street one sweltering July morning and began moving, twisting, and stomping without music, without celebration, and without pause. At first the neighbors laughed, assuming perhaps she mocked the minstrels or rehearsed for a festival. But as hours turned into the fading light of evening, and as sweat poured from her face, the laughter faded into unease. Her husband tried to pull her away, but her limbs shook him off with a power not her own. Her feet struck the earth with relentless rhythm, a rhythm that had no drum, no fiddle, no song, only the silent command of some invisible force. For days she continued, her body racked by exhaustion, collapsing only to rise again and continue the frenzied movement. Onlookers began to whisper of possession, of curses, of God's wrath upon the sinful city. Priests muttered prayers, and neighbors crossed themselves as though evil itself had taken hold. But what unsettled them most was not only Frau Trophia's relentless dancing, it was what came next. Within a week, dozens more joined her, seized by the same strange compulsion. Men and women, young and old, some poor and ragged, some dressed in the garb of the guilds, all moved their feet to an unheard tune, their faces twisted not with joy but with torment. They leapt and spun until blood seeped from their shoes, until their hearts beat dangerously fast, until they collapsed in trembling heaps only to rise again and dance. By the end of July, the streets of Strasbourg were no longer filled with the usual shuffle of trade and gossip, but with the stamping, whirling chaos of the afflicted. People called it a plague, though not of boils or fevers. This was a plague of motion, a madness of the body that turned ordinary citizens into dancers of death. Some collapsed of exhaustion and never rose again, their final breaths taken not in sleep but in convulsion. Others staggered on for days, lips cracked from thirst, muscles twitching beyond their control. Officials of Strasbourg city councilmen, magistrates, and guild leaders watched with alarm as the numbers grew. It was not one or two, nor even a dozen, but soon hundreds, who joined the bizarre spectacle. No tavern's fiddler played, no church bell rang, and yet the people danced as if compelled by some cruel musician hidden in the heavens. Physicians declared it an illness of the blood and recommended that the sufferers continue to dance until it passed, believing the body must purge itself of this strange heat. Stages were built. Musicians were even summoned in hopes of burning the madness out. But the more they played, the more feet pounded the cobblestones, and the more dancers collapsed into death. Rumors spread that this was punishment from Saint Vitus, the saint whose wrath was believed to strike down the sinful with uncontrollable movement. Pilgrims whispered of shrines, where the afflicted might be cured, but the clergy hesitated, torn between pity and fear that the dancers carried not only a curse but a warning. Too many, the city itself seemed under judgment. After all, Strasbourg had seen famine and disease, floods and war. Was this dancing not another sign that God had turned his gaze of fire upon them as July waned? The plague showed no sign of relenting. Housewives abandoned kitchens, apprentices dropped tools, and even guild masters found themselves pulled into the frenzy. The city's normal heart beat the clang of hammers, the chatter of markets. The chanting of monks was drowned out by the ceaseless stamping of feet. Some swore they saw the dancers' eyes glazed over, as if they saw visions invisible to the sane. Others claimed to hear faint music in the distance, though no lute nor drum played. Fear spread faster than the plague itself, for no one could predict who might be next to step into the street and join the unholy dance. And so it was that in the blistering heat of July 1518, Strasbourg found itself possessed not by sword nor flame, but by rhythm. The plague of dancers had begun, and its story would stretch across weeks of horror, confusion, and death. The city had become a stage, its people unwilling performers in a tragedy both grotesque and bewildering. And the world would remember this as the time when men and women danced themselves into graves, while their neighbors watched in terror and disbelief. The days that followed Frau Trophia's strange outburst brought no relief, only escalation. By the first week of August, what had started as a spectacle of one became a torment of many. Dozens of bodies, driven by a will not their own, filled the cobblestone lanes of Strasbourg with ceaseless movement. The heat of summer pressed heavily upon their backs, yet still they moved stumbling, spinning, stomping, their arms flailing, their eyes half rolled back, their voices sometimes groaning, sometimes crying, sometimes shrieking in agony. Onlookers crowded around, too fearful to touch the dancers, yet too fascinated to look away, as if a grotesque theatre had come to life in their very streets. The city council met in haste, its chambers filled with murmurs of panic. Strasbourg was no stranger to hardship. Famines had gnawed at bellies, floods had washed away barns, and pestilence had darkened doorways. Yet never had they seen this, citizens driven not by hunger, not by plague spots, but by some unseen piper whose song none could hear. The councillors asked the physicians for answers, and the physicians replied with solemn confidence. The blood of the afflicted was overheated, corrupted, filled with a fiery humour that demanded release. Let them dance, they insisted. Build them a hall, where their bodies may exhaust the poison. Play music, give rhythm. Let the sickness burn itself out. And so stages were raised, musicians summoned, and the afflicted were herded into open spaces where fiddlers, drummers, and pipers struck up their tunes. But what should have been healing became horror, for the music only fueled the frenzy. The dancers leapt harder, spun faster, until their shoes ran red with blood and their hearts beat dangerously against their ribs. Men collapsed like felled trees, women fell gasping upon the stones, yet even in their collapse, their limbs twitched, their feet sought to move, as if the plague clung to them like a demon that refused to release its grip. Witnesses spoke of children joining their mothers, of old men staggering into the throng, of priests themselves trembling as though tempted to join the cursed rhythm. Some said it was the devil's work, a mocking of holy processions where worshippers once danced in joy before God. Others declared it the wrath of Saint Vitus, whose shrine in Savon was known to kill those afflicted by shaking fits. Pilgrims whispered that only prayer at his chapel could end the madness, but Strasbourg's leaders hesitated, hoping still that earthly cures might suffice. Merchants complained that trade had slowed, for who could barter when neighbors collapsed in the streets? Bakers muttered that ovens cooled, for apprentices fled to watch the dancers. Children grew silent, clutching their mothers' skirts, for even their games seemed powerless against the terror that haunted the city. The sound of hammers and saws, of lutes and bells, was swallowed by the ceaseless thud of feet upon stone. Day and night the dance continued, as if the city itself had become a drum beaten by an unseen hand. The afflicted themselves suffered most of all. There was no joy in their faces, no laughter in their eyes. These were not festival dancers, nor wedding guests, nor revellers in taverns. They were captives of their own bodies, slaves to motion, prisoners of a curse that allowed neither rest nor peace. Some wept even as their legs carried them onward. Some begged for mercy as their hands flailed against the air. Others seemed entranced, their faces blank, their eyes clouded with visions of things unseen. By mid-August, the number swelled to hundreds. Strasbourg was not merely a city with a problem, it was a city possessed. Entire neighborhoods were consumed by the sound of stamping, and fear crept into every household. People asked themselves, who will be next? Will I wake tomorrow with my feet already moving, my arms already twitching to the invisible tune? Will my children be taken, my husband, my wife? And when will it end? The clergy, at last, spoke with louder voices. This was not mere sickness, they proclaimed, but divine judgment. Had not the city sinned with pride, with greed, with indulgence in markets and taverns? Had not the people turned their eyes from God, preferring the riches of merchants to the prayers of saints? Surely this plague of dancers was a punishment. a reminder that no man may turn from heaven's gaze without consequence. Sermons thundered in the cathedrals, calling the people to repentance, to confession, to pilgrimage. The shrine of St. Vitus became a name upon every lip, though it lay miles away and hope seemed farther still. Yet even as priests prayed, dancers died. Some collapsed and never rose, their hearts broken by exhaustion, their bodies overcome by heat and strain. Others lingered in twitching agony, their breath shallow, their skin pale, their feet still jerking to the cursed rhythm. The city buried them quietly, but no grave silenced the plague. More rose to replace the dead, as if some dark hand plucked new victims each day to keep the dance alive. And so Strasbourg spiraled deeper into madness. What began with one woman had become a tide of suffering that washed over the city, defying reason, defying medicine, defying prayer. The council, the physicians, the priests all were powerless. The people looked on in dread, wondering if the city itself would dance until death. By the height of August, Strasbourg had become a place unrecognizable to its own people. What had once been a proud and orderly city of guilds and trade was now little more than a stage for a grotesque drama where every square, every lane, and every market echoed with the ceaseless beat of human feet, the ordinary sounds of life, the clang of blacksmiths, the murmur of merchants. The laughter of children were smothered beneath the thunder of stamping, and the shrill cries of those who could not stop moving. The city did not feel alive, it felt bewitched. The authorities, still trusting the council of physicians, clung to the belief that music would save them. They ordered platforms to be erected, brought forth fiddlers, drummers, and pipers, and commanded that the dancers be given space to release the fever of their blood. But instead of relief, the streets erupted into frenzy. The first notes of the fiddles sent the afflicted into wild contortions. The drummers pounding drove their feet harder into the earth, and the sound of the pipes seemed to pierce their very veins. The musicians played in dread, their hands shaking as they watched the dancers fall into great agony. Some begged to stop, but the council forced them on, and so the music became the cruel companion of the plague. Day offered no respite, and night brought no peace. When darkness fell, torches cast flickering light upon bodies twisting and lurching through the squares. Their shadows, stretched along stone walls, looked like demons cavorting in mockery of holy processions. The cries of the dancers mingled with the instruments, forming a chorus so unnatural that it haunted even those safe behind bolted doors. Some dancers howled as their bodies failed them, others sobbed with exhaustion. Still others stared blankly, their faces serene, as though gazing upon visions unseen by mortal eyes. Rumors spread that they saw spectres guiding their steps, spirits leading them onward into ruin. Fear clutched the hearts of neighbors, families sealed, themselves indoors, whispering prayers against the curse. Mothers pulled children close, warning them never to look too long upon the dancers, lest their own feet betray them. Yet curiosity gnawed at the city, and many could not resist. Windows cracked open, alleys filled with spectators, and travellers came to gape at Strasbourg's living nightmare. What began as horror twisted into morbid fascination. The afflicted became unwilling performers, and the city itself an unwilling theatre. For the dancers, there was no escape. Their feet blistered and bled, their muscles tore beneath the endless strain. Hunger hollowed their bodies, thirst parched their lips, but the compulsion gave no pause. Wives collapsed in front of husbands who wept helplessly. Children screamed as their parents spun uncontrollably before their eyes. No remedy soothed them, no prayer stilled their limbs. It was torment written into flesh, carved into every step. The city leaders argued bitterly. The physicians repeated their claims: hot blood, corrupt humours, an excess of bodily heat that demanded release. Others whispered of hysteria, born from famine and despair. But priests thundered of sin and divine wrath, warning that Strasbourg's pride had provoked the anger of heaven. And beneath their words lurked darker whispers still that this was no sickness, but the devil's work, a dance of damnation. By now, more than 200 had been taken. Death had become a familiar figure in the streets. Men collapsed mid-step, their hearts bursting from the strain. Women fainted, never rising again. Corpses were dragged from the crowds, but the rhythm did not falter. The living continued to move around the dead as though they were nothing but fallen stones. The dance respected neither age, nor gender, neither wealth nor piety. The clergy grew louder in their demands. Only Saint Vitus, they declared, could end the curse. His shrine in Savon must be sought, his relics touched, his water poured upon the afflicted. But the council hesitated, torn between faith and reason, between priests who promised salvation and physicians who promised cure. Each day they delayed. More were seized by the dance, and the fear of the city deepened. Life for those untouched became unbearable. Even in their homes, the stamping of feet echoed through the walls, haunting every moment. Families woke from sleep to the sound of cries in the night. Merchants tried to trade while the rhythm shook their windows. Bakers kneaded dough while screams drifted through the streets. Some swore they heard ghostly music even when the instruments fell silent. Others claimed they saw strange shapes at the edge of their sight, shadows beckoning, lights flickering, hands reaching out. The plague seemed to linger not only in the streets but in the very air. And still, the city gathered to watch. People stared as if spellbound, unable to turn away from the dancer's agony. Foreign visitors spread tales of Strasbourg across the empire, speaking of a cursed city where men and women danced themselves to death. The name of Strasbourg, once known for trade and prosperity, was now spoken with horror. Its identity fused forever with madness. By the close of August, despair hung over the city like a shroud. Medicine had failed, prayer had failed, and leadership faltered. The dancers continued, the deaths mounted, and whispers of doom grew louder. Some began to believe this was more than plague, that it was a warning of the end of days. For if an entire city could be forced to dance itself to ruin, what calamity might fall upon the rest of the world? Thus Strasbourg, enslaved by rhythm, stumbled further into darkness. The dance had no mercy, and death had no hurry. Both waited patiently as the city wore itself down, step by bloody step. By the end of August, the city of Strasbourg teetered upon the edge of collapse. What had begun with Frautraffia weeks earlier had swollen into a frenzy that consumed hundreds. The councillors, who once clung to the physician's advice, now found themselves ridiculed by the people. The stages they had built, the musicians they had hired, all had only deepened the torment. Their solution had turned cure into fuel, and the city murmured that its leaders had worsened the plague by inviting more music into the streets. Fear mixed with anger, and voices rose in accusation. Strasbourg had become cursed not by chance, but by sin in the churches. The priests thundered with growing certainty, this was the wrath of Saint Vitus. For centuries, stories had circulated across Europe of the saint's punishments, visions of villagers struck with trembling, of peasants dancing uncontrollably until they collapsed, of processions of bodies writhing in holy terror. Saint Vitus, the martyr, was known to afflict those who angered him, and Strasbourg, with its pride, its greed, and its indulgence, had surely provoked his hand. The sermons rang loud, echoing from the vaulted ceilings of Strasbourg's grand cathedral. Repent, or be consumed. The people listened, trembling. Some fell to their knees in tears, confessing sins, seeking forgiveness. Others joined processions, chanting prayers to Saint Vitus and begging him to release the afflicted. Candles were lit in his honor, altars adorned with offerings, and the name of Vitus whispered in fear across every home. It was said that only by pilgrimage to his shrine in Savon could the plague be broken. His relics, his holy water, his chapel, they alone might undo the curse. At last, the council relented. The physician's advice had failed, and desperation left them no choice but to yield to the clergy. Orders were given, the afflicted would be taken, not to stages or to musicians, but to the saint himself. Pilgrimage would be their cure. The decision spread swiftly through the city, carried on whispers and shouts, and for the first time in weeks, a faint glimmer of hope flickered in the hearts of Strasbourg's citizens. The preparations were grim, the afflicted were gathered together, staggering, twitching, still moving even when their bodies begged for rest. They were herded like broken cattle, supported by relatives or dragged upon carts when their legs could no longer hold them. Some cried out in terror, fearing that the journey would kill them before it saved them. Others, too weak to speak, let their bodies lurch forward as if the plague itself guided their steps toward the shrine. The procession that left Strasbourg was unlike any seen before. Priests walked at the front, bearing crosses and relics, chanting psalms into the heavy summer air. Behind them shuffled the dancers, still seized by their invisible torment, their feet pounding the dirt road, their eyes glazed with fever. Families followed, weeping and praying, while townsfolk watched from doorways, crossing themselves as the curse passed by. The sight chilled even the most hardened hearts, a parade of agony, moving not in joy but in desperation, each step a plea for mercy. The road to Savin wound through forests and fields, past villages whose inhabitants stared in fear as the pilgrims passed. Some villagers fled indoors, bolting shutters, muttering that the curse might spread if they looked too long. Others fell to their knees, praying aloud, for to witness such madness was to glimpse the wrath of heaven itself. The afflicted danced all the while, some collapsing into the dust only to be lifted again by relatives or priests, their bodies twitching even as they fainted. Death claimed more along the way, their corpses carried in silence at the rear of the procession. At last, after days of weary travel, they reached the shrine of St. Vitus. The chapel stood small but holy upon its hill, its stones weathered, its relics guarded by monks. Here, the afflicted were led inside, where holy water was sprinkled upon them and relics touched to their foreheads. Some were given red shoes consecrated in ritual, which they were to wear as they danced in penance before the saint. The prayers rang loud in the chapel, the incense thick in the air, the monks chanting as though to drown out the rhythm that still consumed the sufferers. Accounts say that some found relief in this holy place. A few dancers collapsed upon the chapel floor and, when they rose, seemed freed of the compulsion. Families wept, kissing the stones in gratitude, praising Vitus for his mercy. Yet others remained tormented, their limbs still jerking, their bodies still driven by the curse. For them, the shrine offered little comfort, only a cruel reminder that not all would be saved. Back in Strasbourg, the city waited anxiously. Each day brought rumors. Some said the shrine had broken the plague. Others claimed it raged on stronger than before. The uncertainty gnawed at every heart, for even if the shrine could save a few, the question lingered. Why had St. Vitus struck at Strasbourg at all? Was this truly punishment for sin, or some deeper mystery no man could fathom? And so the city stood between fear and faith, between hope and despair. The priests proclaimed that salvation was near. The physicians muttered that the madness might yet return, and the people, weary from weeks of terror, clung to whatever scraps of comfort they could find. But beneath it all, the sound of stamping feet still haunted the city. Even as pilgrims prayed at Savin, Strasbourg itself remained restless, for the plague had left its mark not only upon flesh but upon the soul of the city. The story of the dancing plague was far from ended. What had begun as a strange outbreak was becoming legend, its causes debated, its meaning feared. Strasbourg had sought the aid of saints, but even holy water could not wash away the dread that lingered. The dance was not yet done. The pilgrimage to Savin had raised fragile hope, but by early September, hope began to crumble. Though some claimed healing at the shrine of St. Vitus, many returned to Strasbourg still bound to the same torment, their feet jerking, their limbs flailing, their eyes glazed with that dreadful trance. The city had prayed, sung hymns, carried offerings, and even clothed the afflicted in consecrated shoes, yet the rhythm did not vanish. The invisible hand that drove the dancers had not lifted. Instead, Strasbourg found itself once more haunted by the ceaseless stamping of feet. The councillors grew restless, torn between shame and fear. They had trusted physicians and failed. They had trusted priests and failed. Their authority weakened with each passing day, for the people whispered that their leaders were powerless, perhaps even cursed themselves. In taverns and marketplaces, rumors ran wild. Some said the council had angered the heavens by greed. Others swore they had bargained with the devil and unleashed the plague themselves. Fear twisted into suspicion and suspicion into blame. The afflicted multiplied still. New dancers staggered into the streets, some clutching their chests as if dragged by unseen chains, others spinning wildly the moment they joined. The madness showed no pattern. Rich and poor, young and old, pious and wicked alike fell victim. The dance showed no mercy. It mocked the city's prayers, ignored its medicines, defied its leaders. By now, the spectacle had drawn travellers from far and wide. Word of Strasbourg's cursed city had spread across the Holy Roman Empire, and pilgrims, merchants, and curious wanderers came to witness it. Some came in pity, offering prayers. Others came in awe, treating the dancers as if they were signs of prophecy. A few came for morbid entertainment, sneering as they watched men and women collapse, blood pooling at their feet. Strasbourg had become infamous, its suffering turned into rumor, legend, and spectacle. The afflicted themselves, meanwhile, wasted away. Some danced until their bodies shrank to little more than skin and bone, their muscles consumed by endless strain. Many collapsed in seizures, their jaws clenched, their limbs twisted, their faces pale as death. Others perished quietly, their hearts giving way after hours of pounding against ribs. Their corpses were carried off by relatives or dumped into hurried graves. Yet the survivors continued to move, as though death itself could not interrupt the rhythm. Priests redoubled their sermons. They thundered that the people must purify themselves, fast, confess, repent, scourge their flesh if need be. The plague, they said, would not cease until Strasbourg humbled itself before heaven. Some citizens obeyed, lashing themselves in the streets, hoping their suffering might appease Saint Vitus. Yet still the dancers moved on, heedless of flagellation, heedless of prayer. Physicians, in turn, clung stubbornly to their theory of overheated blood. They prescribed diets, baths, bleeding, and rest, but how could rest be given to those whose bodies refused stillness? Families begged doctors to cure their kin, but the doctors themselves grew pale, watching as every remedy failed. A few began to admit what they dared not say aloud, that no earthly cure existed. The people of Strasbourg grew weary, not only of fear but of despair. The sound of feet striking stone had become the city's constant heartbeat, a noise that no wall could shut out, no prayer could silence. The dancers' cries seeped into dreams, haunted meals, poisoned even moments of silence. Neighbors began to avoid one another, retreating into their homes, waiting in dread for the plague to claim them next. And still, no end came. Weeks had passed, deaths had mounted, but the dance continued. The shrine had not broken it, the stages had not broken it, the prayers had not broken it. Strasbourg had become a city trapped in a nightmare that refused to fade. The question lingered louder than ever. Why? Why had this begun? Why had one woman's strange movement blossomed into a plague of hundreds? Why did it persist? And what did it mean? Some swore it was madness born of hunger and heat. Others whispered that it was a curse, a punishment, a divine warning. Still others, more fearful, more superstitious, believed it was the devil's dance, and that Strasbourg itself was damned. Thus the city stumbled deeper into ruin. No cure had worked. No hope endured. The dancers moved ceaselessly as though mocking every attempt to stop them. Strasbourg, helpless, could only watch, pray, and wait for an end that did not come. By the time September dragged into its second week, Strasbourg was no longer a city of trade, music, and cathedral bells. It was a city in chains, held captive by a madness no sword could slay and no prayer could silence. The marketplace, once alive with chatter and bargaining, echoed instead with the ceaseless shuffle of weary feet. The guild halls, once centers of wealth and craft, seemed hollow as merchants and craftsmen abandoned their work to watch in horror as neighbors collapsed on the cobblestones. Even the taverns grew silent, for who could drink ale and laugh when death danced in the very streets? Everywhere, the people whispered that they lived within a curse. Housewives barred shutters and sprinkled holy water on door frames. Fathers led their families in desperate prayers before icons of the Virgin, whispering that perhaps Mary might intercede where Vitus had not. Children clung to their mother's skirts, too afraid to step outside, for they feared even a glance at the dancers might draw them into the plague. The afflicted, however, did not rest. At all hours, their feet beat the earth, striking against stone until the sound seeped into every wall. By day, they stumbled through squares and narrow streets, their arms twitching, their faces burning with fever. By night, torches lit their exhausted figures as they jerked and spun like marionettes pulled by unseen strings. The city never slept, for the dance allowed no silence. Even the owls and night birds seemed to grow quiet, as though nature itself recoiled from the spectacle. The council, desperate to maintain order, imposed new decrees. Dancers were to be confined, dragged into barns, halls, and hospitals where they could be watched and perhaps controlled. Yet the effort proved futile. The moment doors were shut, the afflicted hurled themselves against them, pounding until wood splintered. Desperate to return to the streets, families tried to tie down their kin with ropes, but the bodies thrashed violently, often breaking bonds or bruising themselves until relatives let go in despair. The wealthier citizens fled. Some packed carts and sought refuge in villages outside Strasbourg's walls, believing distance would shield them from the curse. Others hid in cellars, refusing to step outside until the plague passed. But no matter where one went, the rumor of stamping feet followed, spreading like a ghost through the countryside. Strasbourg had become infamous. A warning whispered across the Rhine and beyond. The poor had no such escape. They watched helplessly as their loved ones were claimed, one by one, forced into a dance that drained body and soul. Mothers wailed as children collapsed. Husbands staggered as wives were seized. Old men clutched their rosaries, their trembling lips whispering prayers that went unanswered. The misery was not only of flesh but of spirit. Strasbourg was breaking. Priests declared fasts, ordering citizens to abandon meat, wine, and luxury until St. Vitus was appeased. Processions wound through the streets, chanting penitential psalms. Yet even as hymns filled the air, the afflicted twitched and stamped beside them, their bodies heedless of piety. To see a man collapse during prayer, blood dripping from his feet, was to feel despair so deep that faith itself trembled. The physicians, too, faltered. They had bled, bathed, and prescribed, yet nothing availed. Some muttered that perhaps the dancer's madness was not of the body but of the mind, that fear, hunger, and sorrow had driven them into delirium. But even this failed to explain why the affliction spread like fire among straw. Theories multiplied, yet none could halt the endless rhythm. Meanwhile, the deaths mounted. Each morning brought fresh bodies, carried off in carts, buried hurriedly without ceremony. Priests prayed over shallow graves as bells tolled, though even the sound of bells was drowned by the pounding feet of the living. The line between mourner and sufferer grew thin, for at any moment a mourner might join the dance, weeping as they realized their fate. Strasbourg's people felt trapped in a nightmare without waking. They asked one another, was this God's wrath, a punishment for hidden sins? Or had Satan himself set foot within their walls, laughing as he made men and women dance until their hearts burst? No answer came. Only the rhythm, endless and merciless, filled the silence where answers should have been. By the end of September, the city stood hollow-eyed, gaunt and trembling. Its leaders were powerless, its priests weary, its physicians defeated. The afflicted danced still, their bodies wrecked but their movements unbroken, as if mocking the very idea of resistance. Strasbourg was in chains not of iron, but of dread and despair. And though the city begged for release, the dance did not cease. October crept upon Strasbourg, and with it came the chill of autumn winds sweeping across the Rhine. The air grew sharp, leaves turned to gold and crimson, and the harvest that should have brought relief instead lay rotting in the fields, for too few hands remained steady enough to gather it. The city that once thrived upon trade, wine, and grain now starved, weakened not only by the famine that had lingered since the last year, but also by the plague that showed no mercy. The dancing did not cease with the change of season. If anything, it grew more grotesque beneath the grey skies. Men and women stumbled through piles of fallen leaves, their feet smeared with blood and mud, their bodies gaunt from weeks of torment. The colder air did nothing to calm their fever. Instead, their breath came in steaming gasps, rising into the morning mist as though the city itself exhaled suffering. By night, the torches glowed against the black sky, casting monstrous shadows of jerking limbs upon the walls, a macabre theatre no one wished to watch, yet none could avoid. For the citizens who had not yet succumbed, fear settled deeper with every passing day. It was not the loud panic of summer, but a quiet, gnawing dread that hollowed out hearts. Families no longer dared to laugh, neighbors avoided each other's gaze, as if eye contact alone might invite the curse. Silence spread across streets where once the sounds of smiths, weavers, and merchants had rung. Now only the dancers filled the void, stamping, twitching, collapsing, and rising again. The priests grew harsher in their words. They declared that Strasbourg had failed to repent enough, that its pride, its indulgence, and its arrogance had blackened it before heaven. This city, they thundered, has become a theatre of sin. Until every man and woman bows before God in sackcloth and ashes, the curse will not lift. Thus more processions were ordered, more fasts declared, more candles lit before icons. The faithful lashed their backs raw in hope of appeasing Saint Vitus. But still the dancers moved on untouched by penance. The physicians, too, had grown desperate. Some abandoned their posts entirely, fleeing to nearby villages. Others stubbornly recorded every symptom, scribbling in ledgers with trembling hands, hoping that knowledge might reveal what cures could not. They noted how the plague struck without pattern, how exhaustion failed to end the movements, how hearts burst mid-dance, and how the rhythm seemed to pass from body to body like contagion. Theories multiplied: fever of the blood, poison of the mind, corruption of the air, but no theory brought peace. Meanwhile, the afflicted wasted away in body, but not in movement. Many no longer had the strength to speak, their lips cracked, their voices hoarse, their eyes sunken. Yet still, their legs twitched, their feet shuffled, their arms flailed. Even those lying upon deathbeds were seen trembling as though invisible strings still tugged at their limbs. Death came as a mercy, yet death itself seemed slow to claim them, as if mocking their agony. And death was everywhere. The graveyards filled at a pace the priests could not keep up with. Mass burials became common, the earth swallowing dozens at a time. Bells tolled each morning and evening, their mournful sound mingling with the stamping of feet until the two were indistinguishable. Strasbourg became a city of dirges and footsteps, of grief and rhythm, of life that felt like dying. The people began to ask darker questions. Was this truly St. Vitus's wrath, or had Strasbourg been abandoned by God altogether? Was the devil playing a cruel jest upon the city, dancing with invisible feet among the afflicted? Or perhaps, some whispered, this was no supernatural curse at all, but a madness born of hunger, sorrow, and despair. If so, then the entire city was already infected, for who among them was free of hunger? Who among them was untouched by sorrow? Superstition grew wild. Some claimed that witches had cursed Strasbourg, sending demons to seize its people. Others muttered that the plague had risen from the earth itself, a poison seeping through wells and food. Mothers warned children not to wander near the afflicted lest the curse leap upon them. Yet the curse showed no pattern, sometimes sparing those who walked beside the dancers, sometimes seizing men in their own homes. No explanation soothed the terror. The councillors met often, their faces pale and their voices hushed. What else could they do? They had tried stages, music, confinement, shrines, prayers, fasts, penance, medicine, yet the dance mocked them all. Their city's coffers emptied, its trade slowed, its reputation blackened across the empire. Some councillors muttered that Strasbourg was ruined already, that nothing remained but to endure until the madness burned itself out. Others argued that harsher measures must be taken, though no one could name what those might be. And so, the city waited, trapped in its own silence, broken only by the endless rhythm of the dancers. The stamping of feet became the pulse of Strasbourg itself, echoing through dreams, through prayers, through the very stones of its streets. The season of fear had come, and still the dancers danced. As the year drew deeper into autumn, Strasbourg seemed to sink under a shroud of misery. What had begun in the burning heat of midsummer now endured into the season of frost, as if time itself had been chained to the rhythm of the dancers' feet. The leaves that once coloured the city with gold now lay trampled into black decay on the streets, crushed by ceaseless footsteps that would not still. The afflicted had become spectres of their former selves. Their faces were hollow, eyes ringed with darkness, lips cracked from thirst. Some wore grimaces of agony, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, while others appeared vacant, as though their souls had departed and only their flesh remained, moving like puppets bound to an unseen master. Their garments were shredded, their feet bloodied, and the cobblestones stained with crimson and mud bore witness to their torment. The cold crept into Strasbourg, carried on bitter winds. Yet the dancers seemed untouched by season or weather. Snow dusted their shoulders only to vanish against their burning skin. Some collapsed in icy streets, their limbs jerking even as death neared, while others stamped on without pause, their breath steaming in the frosty air like smoke from dying fires. For those not seized by the curse, dread settled into daily life. Families shut themselves away, whispering prayers in darkened rooms while their stores of food dwindled. Children whimpered at the distant pounding that echoed through the night, asking their parents if St. Vitus would soon claim them too. Their mothers comforted them with trembling voices, though their own hearts quaked with the same fear. The council, once so certain of its authority, now seemed powerless. Each decree had failed, each cure had withered. Their meetings were quiet, their words hollow. They no longer spoke of victory, but only of enduring. Physicians scribbled feverishly in their ledgers, trying to find reason in the madness. But their remedies, bleeding, baths, herbs, prayers, proved as useless as silence before thunder. Some abandoned their posts, unable to watch more lives crumble, while others whispered in private that this was not illness of the body, but a corruption of the mind or soul. The priests thundered still, but their sermons rang weaker with each passing week. They called for fasting, penance and repentance, proclaiming Strasbourg a city stained with sin. Yet even they faltered in private, whispering doubts in confessionals. Had God abandoned the city? Could even St. Vitus or the Virgin end such a punishment? Faith still lived, but thin and fragile, like a candle flickering in the wind. The afflicted stamped on, day and night. At dusk their figures loomed in torchlight, shadows twisting upon stone walls in grotesque shapes. By morning they staggered through frost and mist, collapsing only to rise again, bound to a rhythm no ear could hear. Death came too many, but even death seemed reluctant, often delayed, until the body was broken beyond recognition. The graveyards grew crowded, the frozen earth made burial hard, and gravediggers cursed as they lowered dozens into shallow pits. Limbs stiffened in strange angles as though the dance clung even in death. Bells tolled endlessly, their echoes mingling with stamping feet until the city no longer knew where morning ended, and madness began. By now, Strasbourg was more shadow than city. Merchants no longer called their wares, neighbors no longer spoke, children no longer played. The only constant was the ceaseless rhythm, beating like a curse into the bones of the living. People whispered that demons roamed among the afflicted, that witches had cursed the Rhine, that the devil himself laughed as he led the city in a grotesque procession. No one spoke of cures anymore, no one spoke of salvation. They longed only for silence, for stillness, for an end. Whether by miracle, mercy, or ruin, the people prayed only to see Strasbourg freed of its nightmare. But December neared, nights grew longer, famine deepened, and the stamping continued. The light of hope was nearly gone, and yet the dance did not stop. Winter settled heavily upon Strasbourg, and with its cold came the darkest hour of the plague. The rooftops lay buried beneath snow, the alleyways filled with ice. The cathedral loomed like a silent sentinel over a city in despair. Yet the dancers still moved. The sound of their stamping filled every corner, every chamber, every dream. Even when doors were shut and windows barred, the rhythm bled through walls like the heartbeat of some monstrous being that had claimed the city as its own. The afflicted were little more than walking corpses, skin clung tightly to bone. Sweat froze upon their brows, and their clothing clung in filthy tatters. Some staggered slowly, barely lifting their feet, while others flailed violently, arms jerking, heads snapping back in grotesque contortions. Their feet were ruined beyond recognition, raw flesh and torn muscle beating against frozen stones until trails of blood painted the streets. No matter how broken their bodies, they continued, compelled by an invisible force. Every collapse became a spectacle of horror. A dancer would falter, sway, then fall with a final cry, their heart succumbing to the merciless strain. Sometimes they convulsed upon the snow, limbs twitching until stillness claimed them. Others simply froze mid-step, their bodies crumpling to the ground like marionettes whose strings had been severed. The living danced on around them, to bound to the rhythm to stop, circling the corpses as though death itself were part of the procession. The carts came daily, piled with the fallen. Gravediggers groaned as they worked, their hands numb from cold, their picks striking the frozen earth. There were too many to bury in neat graves. Trenches had to be dug, long and wide. where bodies were lowered together one atop the other. Faces stared upward, mouths frozen open as if in silent screams, limbs locked in twisted shapes. Even in death, the dance clung to them, leaving them stiffened in unnatural postures. The graveyards filled, the bells tolled endlessly, and still the stamping feet echoed through the city. Physicians kept their records, though the words grew darker with every entry. They wrote of bursting hearts, of blood seeping from noses and ears, of brains breaking beneath the weight of frenzy. They confessed in their pages that no salve, no herb, no bleeding, no bath, no prayer had changed the course of the disease. Some argued of corrupted humours, others of poisoned air, but none could explain why the feet refused to rest, why death came only after such relentless torment. Many turned away from their craft, defeated, whispering that the affliction came not from nature but from realms unseen. The priests thundered still from their pulpits, but their voices carried more fear than faith. They proclaimed that Strasbourg had sinned, that heaven's wrath had descended, that only confession and penance could appease the saints. But the pilgrimage to St. Vitus had proven hollow, leaving the faithful more broken than before. Many priests confessed in private that no intercession had come, that their prayers rang unanswered in heaven. Still they led processions, still they called for fasting, yet even they began to tremble at the thought that God himself had turned his face from the city. Among the people, rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered of witches casting curses into the waters of the Rhine. Others spoke of devils dancing among the afflicted, unseen but laughing as they drove the living to ruin. A few dared utter the most terrible belief, that it was no witch, no devil, but the Almighty himself striking the city in vengeance. Fear bred distrust, distrust bred silence, and Strasbourg became a place where neighbours no longer greeted one another, where families spoke only in hushed tones, where every creak of wood or gust of wind felt like the whisper of doom. And still the dancers moved. Day bled into night, night into day, and the stamping went on. Torches lit their frenzied movements in the darkness, casting monstrous shadows upon the walls. By morning, the snow bore fresh stains of blood, and the air was heavy with the stench of sweat and death. Some collapsed only to rise again, staggering back to their cruel rhythm, as if even death recoiled from claiming them too soon. It seemed too many that Strasbourg itself was bound to an invisible drum, each stone and street pulsing to its dreadful beat. The council grew silent. No longer did they argue over remedies. No longer did they summon musicians. No longer did they order pilgrimages or penances. Their chambers were hushed, their voices hollow, their only wish that the nightmare might end, no matter the cost. Merchants had abandoned their stalls, inns stood empty, and guildhalls silent. Life itself had fled Strasbourg, leaving only shadows and the endless sound of steps. The people ceased asking when deliverance would come. They wondered instead whether there would be any who lived to see it. Families dwindled, homes emptied, and the graveyards grew ever wider. It seemed too many that Strasbourg was not merely afflicted but possessed, a city in the grip of some monstrous hand that used human flesh as its instrument. And so the stamping continued. Through hunger, through frost, through despair, the dancers moved as though guided by a power beyond heaven and earth, a power that mocked prayer, defied medicine, and devoured lives. Strasbourg was no longer a city of men and women. It was a stage for death's grim ballet. And in those bleakest days of winter, death itself seemed to lead the steps. The winter dragged on, and Strasbourg seemed trapped in a nightmare without end. Snow fell heavy upon the rooftops, muffling the city in a white shroud, yet beneath the deceptive stillness the terrible rhythm endured. By now the dance had claimed hundreds, their bodies lying in trenches beyond the city walls, their names whispered only in grief by the few who still dared to speak of them. But still, impossibly, the afflicted moved. Their footsteps thudded endlessly against frozen earth, echoing through alleyways, resounding across the marketplace, pulsing like a heartbeat that refused to die. The dancers had become spectres of themselves. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, their flesh wasted by hunger and exhaustion. Yet their feet did not rest. To the onlooker it was as though invisible chains bound their ankles, dragging them forward in grotesque steps. Some clawed at their own legs, trying to tear away the compulsion. Others begged aloud for mercy, for death, for release. their pleas drowned beneath the stamping chorus. Husbands watched wives perish, mothers collapsed before their children. Yet even grief could not stop the rhythm. It was as though Strasbourg had been turned into a single great stage, where life and death intermingled in cruel procession. The air grew heavy with despair. Inns that once rang with laughter were silent, their shutters closed. The guildhalls stood empty, markets bare, workshops abandoned. The city that had once thrived with trade and craft was now little more than a ghostly shell, its heart consumed by frenzy. Even the bells of the cathedral seemed muted, as if reluctant to disturb the cursed dance that dominated every street. The priests no longer thundered of sin, their sermons reduced to murmurs of helplessness, their prayers choked by fear. The council, once proud and resolute, now sat in grim silence, their authority shattered. Rumors multiplied in the vacuum of hope. Some swore that angels of death had descended upon the city, unseen but directing the steps of the afflicted. Others whispered that Strasbourg itself had been cursed, that its foundations were rotten, its soil poisoned, its stones echoing with ancient wrath. There were tales of a pact broken, of forgotten sins, of old blood spilled upon the land that now demanded repayment in suffering. Fear twisted into suspicion, neighbors accused neighbors, and families hid within their homes, terrified that even speaking too loudly might summon the plague upon them. And yet, despite this suffocating terror, there remained a grim fascination. Children peered through cracks in shutters, eyes wide at the sight of the dancers staggering in the snow. Some claimed to see patterns in the madness, strange formations that emerged from chaos, circles and spirals, figures that resembled symbols known only to scholars of old. A few even whispered that it was no disease but a ritual, a summoning, though none dared speak aloud what might be called forth by such a dance. The city's physicians, driven nearly to madness themselves, began to abandon their posts. Their journals grew incoherent, filled with ink blots, smudged words, and desperate sketches of twisted bodies. Some wrote of visions they claimed to see in the dancers' eyes, of fire, of shadows, of figures moving just beyond the edge of sight. Others confessed that they felt the rhythm in their own bones, that in dreams they stamped their feet endlessly, unable to stop until jolted awake in terror. It seemed to them that the affliction was spreading not merely through bodies, but through the very soul of the city. Merchants fled to neighboring towns, their wagons laden with what little they could salvage. Refugees whispered of the horrors within Strasbourg, carrying tales that grew darker with each telling. The surrounding villages shunned the city, cutting off trade, fearful that the plague might seep outward. Strasbourg was left alone, a city isolated by both geography and dread, its people abandoned to their fate. Within the walls, desperation deepened. Some families turned to old superstitions, laying charms at their doors, burning herbs, muttering forgotten prayers to ward off evil. Others embraced the darkest measures, offering sacrifices of animals, hoping blood might satisfy whatever unseen power drove the dance. A few, mad with grief, even spoke of offering themselves willingly, stepping into the circle of dancers as though to join them, believing that only by surrendering could they be spared the torment of waiting. And still the dancers moved. Day after day, week upon week, their bodies deteriorated, yet their rhythm endured. It seemed endless, a perpetual motion machine powered not by flesh, but by something greater, something darker. Observers began to fear that the dance would never cease, that Strasbourg would forever be marked as a city condemned to stamp itself into ruin. The rhythm had become not merely a sound, but a presence, a cruel companion that haunted dreams, that vibrated through stone and timber, that lodged itself within the marrow of every survivor. The breaking point came quietly. One morning, when the snow had turned to slush and the first hints of thaw touched the air, the dancers began to fall not one by one, but in waves. Hearts burst, lungs gave out, bodies collapsed in heaps, and for the first time in months the stamping grew fainter. By nightfall, silence began to spread across the streets. Not complete silence, for a few still staggered, but a quiet unlike any the city had known for what felt like an eternity. It was a silence heavy with exhaustion, with grief, with the weight of the countless dead. The people of Strasbourg did not rejoice. They did not cheer or sing. They emerged slowly from their homes, cautious, unbelieving. They looked upon the fallen with hollow eyes. upon the broken bodies strewn like autumn leaves across the squares, upon the red-stained snow. And they understood. The city had survived, but it was forever changed. The plague had not simply taken lives, it had shattered faith, broken trust, and carved into memory a horror that no generation would ever forget. And in that silence, a question lingered, unspoken yet heavy in every heart. Had the dance ended of its own will, or was this only a pause? Before the rhythm returned, when the stamping finally ceased, Strasbourg did not feel relief so much as emptiness. The sudden absence of the sound, that endless, maddening rhythm that had haunted every waking and sleeping hour, left the city in a silence so profound it felt unnatural. People wandered the streets as though in a daze, hearing echoes where none remained, half expecting at any moment that another foot would strike the stones and begin the torment anew. The silence itself became oppressive, a reminder of how thoroughly the city's soul had been broken. The dead far outnumbered the living. Trenches yawned wide beyond the walls, filled with bodies stacked in grotesque profusion. Snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth stained dark by blood, and the stench of rot rose into the air. The gravediggers worked without pause, their arms weary, their faces hollow with despair. They did not bother with prayers anymore. They simply lowered the dead and covered them quickly, eager to finish before darkness fell. There was no time for dignity. There was only the need to hide the bodies before disease claimed the survivors as well. Families mourned in silence, their grief too deep for words. Some gathered at the edge of the mass graves, whispering names, casting tokens or scraps of clothing into the earth before the soil covered them forever. Others could not even find their kin, lost among the countless dead, and were left to live with the torment of never knowing where their loved ones lay. Children were left without parents, parents without children, and entire lineages erased in the space of a season. Strasbourg was scarred not only by death, but by the tearing apart of families, the severing of bonds that had bound the community for generations. The survivors themselves bore marks that would never fade. Some limped permanently, their feet ruined by days of involuntary stamping. Others twitched and jerked long after the plague had ended, their bodies remembering rhythms they could not forget. Nightmares haunted them, visions of endless motion, of bloody footprints, of shadows dancing when none should be. Many woke screaming, certain they still heard the beat of feet outside their doors. Strasbourg became a city of haunted faces, where every glance carried memories of horror. The council reconvened, but their voices were subdued, their confidence gone. Once they had spoken with authority, but now they whispered as men broken by failure. Their decisions had led nowhere, their decrees had saved no one, their remedies had only deepened the suffering. The people looked upon them not with respect but with bitterness, for it was known that when hope was most needed, those in power had been powerless. Authority itself seemed hollow, and many began to place their faith not in rulers or priests, but in their own endurance. The church, too, found itself diminished. The priests had called for processions, for penance, for pilgrimage to St. Vitus, yet none of these acts had halted the plague. Faith had not saved Strasbourg. In the taverns that slowly reopened, whispers grew bold, whispers that perhaps heaven had turned its face away, or worse, that heaven had no part in the affair at all. Some clung even tighter to belief, desperate to salvage meaning, but many drifted into doubt, carrying in their hearts the quiet conviction that if God had permitted such horror, his mercy was too distant to be trusted. Yet not all fell into despair. Among the ruins, resilience began to flicker. Merchants reopened stalls, though their goods were meager. Blacksmiths returned to their forges, their hammers striking rhythm into the silence, a different rhythm, one of creation rather than destruction. Women gathered in the markets, trading scraps of food, comforting one another, stitching together what fragments of life remained. Children played again in the alleyways, their laughter brittle at first but slowly strengthening. Strasbourg was not healed, but it lived, and that in itself was a defiance against the plague that had sought to erase it. The scholars and chroniclers began their work, writing of the strange affliction with quills scratching late into the night. Some insisted it had been caused by poisoned air, others by corrupted blood, others still by divine punishment or demonic curse. They disagreed fiercely, yet all agreed on one truth. Never before had Europe seen such madness, and none could say with certainty that it would not happen again. Their writings, though filled with speculation, were laced with dread, as if by committing the story to parchment they might either preserve its memory or somehow protect future generations. And indeed, the memory of the dancing plague became a shadow that lingered over Strasbourg. Travellers who passed through whispered of it, carrying tales far and wide. In taverns across Germany, France and beyond, men told stories of a city where people danced until death, where music was not joy but torment, where the human body itself became an instrument of suffering. The story grew in the telling. Some claimed the afflicted had danced with fire in their eyes, others that devils had led the steps. But always the truth at the core remained. Strasbourg had been cursed with a dance that killed. As spring warmed the land, green returned to the fields, and the river thawed. Life began to flow again. Yet within the city the scars remained visible. Empty houses stood as grim memorials to families erased. Streets still bore stains of blood that no rain could fully wash away. The silence of winter gave way to the hum of daily labor, but beneath it all the memory of that dreadful rhythm lingered. It was said that in the still of the night, when the wind shifted just so, one could hear faint echoes, the sound of feet striking stone, the ghost of the plague that had nearly destroyed Strasbourg. And in that memory, fear lingered. The people knew that what had happened once could happen again. The city lived, but it did not rest. Every cough, every fever, every sudden madness was met with suspicion. The question remained on every tongue, though rarely spoken aloud. Would the dance return? Years passed and Strasbourg rebuilt itself. Yet the memory of that cursed summer and winter lingered like a scar upon the soul of the city. The markets filled once more with merchants. The guildhalls rang with the clamour of labour, and the cathedral bells pealed again for weddings and feasts. Life returned as life always does, stubborn and unyielding. But beneath the hum of commerce and the laughter of children, there remained an unease. A whisper carried in the wind, the tale of the dance that would not die. Those who had survived spoke of it. Rarely. Some could not speak of it at all, their memories too heavy, their dreams too haunted by visions of endless stamping feet. Others recounted their stories in hushed tones, their voices trembling as though speaking aloud might summon the curse once more. The city, though vibrant on the surface, bore hidden fractures in its spirit. Families forever broken, trust in faith and authority weakened. A sense that something unseen and uncontrollable had brushed against their world. These were wounds time could not fully mend. Chroniclers preserved the story, their quills scratching parchment with grim diligence. They wrote of Frau Trafia, the woman who had begun it all with her strange, solitary dance. They wrote of the dozens, then hundreds, who followed her into frenzy. They wrote of the council's desperate measures, of music played to calm, and instead fueling the fire, of pilgrimages and prayers, of endless nights where the stamping never ceased. They recorded the bodies that fell, the graves that filled, the silence that followed. Some wrote with the cool detachment of scholars, others with the raw grief of witnesses. But all agreed the events of 1518 were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Theories multiplied. Physicians in later generations claimed the plague was the result of ergot, a fungus that grew upon rye, seeding madness into the blood. Others dismissed this, pointing to the organized frenzy, the strange patterns of movement, the persistence of rhythm. Was it mass hysteria, born of famine, fear, and faith? Was it psychological collapse, a collective madness born from stress and superstition? Or was it something darker, something no science could ever name? Each answer raised new questions, and none satisfied. The plague of dancing remained a riddle, a wound in history. Legends grew around the tale. Some said the afflicted had danced with spirits unseen, compelled by demons to stamp their way into hell. Others claimed angels had descended to test the city, and Strasbourg had failed. Minstrels turned the tale into song, their verses carrying the story far beyond Alsace. In villages across Europe, mothers warned their children not to mock the saints, lest they be struck with a dance they could not stop. The dancing plague became both caution and curiosity, both history and myth, yet the scholars could not let it rest. Through the centuries, the story resurfaced, each generation puzzling anew over its meaning. In libraries, dusty tomes held accounts of the plague, their pages yellowed but their words alive with dread. physicians, psychologists, historians all returned to the question, why did they dance? No answer satisfied, for the dance defied explanation. It belonged neither fully to science nor to faith, but to that strange space where mystery and terror converge. For Strasbourg itself, the memory became a ghost woven into the stones in quiet moments. Some claimed to hear faint echoes in the marketplace, a tapping upon the cobblestones when no one was near. On warm summer nights when the moon hung low and the air was still, there were those who swore they saw figures flicker in the corner of their vision, shadows swaying, feet stamping, softly vanishing when looked at directly. The plague had ended, but its spirit lingered, a phantom rhythm forever tied to the city. And beyond Strasbourg, the story lived on as one of Europe's strangest tales. Historians spoke of it as a warning of human fragility, of the thin veil that separates reason from madness. Artists painted it as a vision of suffering, grotesque figures locked in movement. Writers used it as metaphor, poets as symbol. It became part of the law of humanity, a reminder that there are forces, whether of mind, body, or spirit, that lie beyond control. Centuries later, we still wonder. We read the accounts, we study the theories, we imagine the snow-stained streets filled with blood and motion, the cries of exhaustion, the silence that followed. We feel a shiver, knowing that the line between our world and theirs is not so distant. For what happened once may happen again. The human heart still beats, the human mind still trembles, and in times of fear and hunger and despair, who is to say the dance might not return? So the legacy of the dancing plague endures. It is a story that refuses to die, a rhythm that echoes across history, faint but insistent. It reminds us that humanity is both fragile and strange, capable of endurance but also of collapse. Strasbourg healed, but it never forgot. And neither do we. For in the quiet hours, when we imagine footsteps where none should be, when we hear in the stillness a faint, ghostly beat, we remember Strasbourg. 1518, and the plague that made a city dance until death.